as you can see, to talk a little bit about kind of the opportunity side of the equation, as you can see, this is kind of a simple chart, but it looks at exports and imports going back to 2012 up until late last year, essentially in 2019. As you can see, the trend, certainly in the early years, was pretty healthy. We had some, I would call some, to use the vernacular lately, some flattening of the curve in 2019, and certainly in 2020, we're going to see some significant declines. But again, as a result of the COVID situation. But in general, the good news for either existing or prospective Kentucky exporters is that there still are opportunities up there, and the trend is definitely in the positive direction. So the second slide looks at the idea of global exports, and it kind of counterposes those against cumulative number of trade agreements around the world. And as you can see on the left, exports basically are in the trillions of dollars, and you can see the blue area basically manufactured goods, commodities, things like iron, iron ore, coal, petroleum, commodities like corn and soybeans, things like that would be in this second category of light blue. And then services, as you can see, if you go back to 1995, services was a relatively small part of the overall equation when it came to exports globally. But as you can see here, the trend is definitely, in terms of the service sector, is improved quite dramatically. And in fact, that's good news for us in the United States, because the U.S. by far is the world's largest manufacturer of export services. Which I guess kind of begs the question of what exactly do we mean by a service exporter? Can anyone give us an example of what type of activities would revolve around a service export? Can anybody, Dwight or Ian, I don't know if you're on or not, but can anyone help out with some examples of what we mean by a service export? Ian, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry, I was eating a lunch. I didn't think anybody wanted to hear me eat my food.
That's okay. That's okay. Can you maybe kind of share with us some examples of what we mean by service exports?
No, it's all right. Here, I've got my mouth full. Go ahead.
Okay,
Sorry.
no worries, no worries. Well, let me just kind of highlight a few of them. As I said, the U.S. is the largest service exporter, and though we run a deficit on the goods side, on the commodities and manufacturers, or what we call goods service side, the service side, we run a significant surplus. And so we're talking about things like, for example, we're talking about transportation, insurance, software, telecommunications. Our friends in Hollywood movies are a significant source of service income and export income for us in the U.S. Kim and I were just talking about her husband being a professor at UK. When I was teaching at Mankato State several years ago, we had a large number of international students. And when you think about it, international education is a huge export opportunity, not only for the US, but for other countries like Australia and the UK as well. And so, again, educational services, all those international students that are living and studying in the US, basically that constitutes a service export for America, basically, for the most part. But the number one service export, not just for the US, but also for most places around the world, is actually tourism. Okay, when you think about it, tourism is you have people visiting your shores, spending their money on hotels, restaurants, tourist activities and things like that. So tourism is actually number one worldwide in terms of service export. But as I mentioned, the US has a significant surplus on the service side, basically. And in fact, only one country, India, do we actually run a deficit for the most part. So that's on this again, some improvements again on the export side. The second part of this chart looks at cumulative trade agreements, and again, it kind of echoes this issue about service exports. As you can see, in the early 70s and 80s, most of the trade agreements that were put into place, either on a multilateral or bilateral basis, were basically focusing on goods or merchandise, if you will. Conversely, again, if you look back over the last 10 or 15 years or so, we've seen this tremendous growth in terms of adding services to the equation, basically, in terms of export. Again, the U.S. has been a key part of that for the most part. one reason I like this slide also is that it points out that, in fact, the U.S. currently has 15 free trade agreements in place, encompassing 21 countries around the world. And so that's important. I'll come back to that in just a second. But as we move forward, basically, we'll see that trade agreements in places like Singapore, Australia, Chile, Peru, Colombia can be a way for Kentucky exports to kind of tap into for the most part. Even more recently in Japan, we've just started a new free trade agreement with the Japanese, primarily focused on agricultural goods and agricultural products going into the Japanese market. But again, as we develop a strategy, or as you as a Kentucky exporter develop a strategy, kind of the low-hanging fruit, if you will, is basically looking at countries or markets where we have an existing either multilateral or bilateral trade agreement in place for the most part. That's kind of where you want to start. And of course, the most important trade agreement that we have in place as of right now, again, with a new version of what I call NAFTA 3.0, or the U.S., Mexico, Canada trade agreement, basically took effect in July of this year, basically July 1. So this slide looks at merchandise exports specifically in terms of the U.S. for NAFTA and the rest of the world. And you can see that NAFTA constitutes about a third of U.S. merchandise exports. In the case of Canada and Mexico, obviously a significantly higher number for the most part. But most of this growth in terms of, let's call it North American trade, is really driven by what I would call regional clustering or regionalization of supply chains. And of course, the automotive sector is probably case number one in terms of regional supply chains. And of course, us here in Kentucky, we're obviously a big part of that for the most part as well. One of the things I think that you hear a lot of discussion about kind of in a post-COVID scenario is that this trend of regionalization of supply chains, particularly in a North American sense, is going to continue. In fact, I think that trend will actually accelerate for the most part. And so again, that means that if you're going to develop as a Kentucky exporter, finding some way to tap into to the NAFTA or the USMCA agreement going forward is going to be critically important to your overall kind of corporate strategy. Sorry about that. They're cutting my grass outside of my place right now, so it's not good timing. But those things happen. Before I move on to some of the practical reasons why Kentucky firms should consider exporting, any questions at this point in time? Kim, did you have anything, or is there anything in the chat box or anything like that?
Nope, there's nothing.
Okay. All right. Well, I will move on then, and kind of the second part of what I'll focus on is what I call reasons to export. And some of these are kind of fairly intuitive for the most part. Some of them I suspect we probably haven't thought much about, in terms of reasons why we ought to maybe get into the export game for the most part. So let's focus on some of those. First of all, exporting is a relatively inexpensive way to kind of test the waters, if you will, in terms of foreign markets and also foreign competitors as well. What you find is that sometimes when you do venture overseas, you find that you have competitors in places like Colombia or Peru or Indonesia that you don't have domestically here in the United States. And so, excuse me. So this is a good way to kind of test that foreign competition, at least get you better plugged in. That's what I like to call the toe in the water strategy for the most part. It can be done both on a country by country basis, or it could be done in a regional basis. I lived for a number of years in Singapore, in Southeast Asia. And so it was very common for U.S. companies to develop kind of an ASEAN regional strategy, looking at, say, Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia, and maybe as a small regional market for the most part. So that's what I mean by kind of regional approach for the most part. Okay, let's move on to talk a little bit about, again, some other reasons why we might want to go about and consider exporting. And there's one big major one, and that is that exports can help us balance or offset counter-cyclical or cyclical declines in U.S. sales for the most part. This picture on the right is an interesting company. I don't know if you've ever seen a piece of equipment like this. It's manufactured by a company called Power Curbers. They're out of Salisbury, North Carolina. And what they found is that with the advent or the onset of the Great Recession in 2008, their business went from what had been 80% domestic, 20% international, and those percentages were just completely flipped for the most part. It became an 80% export scenario, 2008, 2009, 2010 timeframe. And I think it's probably safe to say that had it not been for international opportunities, this company may not even exist today. And you may know some other examples. Maybe your own company, went through a really tough time during the Great Recession during that time frame from 2008 to 2010, 2011 time frame for the most part. I'm going to show you just a quick video in it, and this is a video of Dyke Messinger, who's the founder of the company, and it talks a little bit about, this is a CNN clip, but it talks a little bit about what they do and again, the importance to them of international at this point in time. No, that's not what I want. There we go. So again, this is just about a short clip from CNN. Okay. So again, classic example. This company is now thriving. Actually, it just had a change of ownership. Dyke Messinger, who's again the founder of the company, sold it a couple years ago to a company in Charlotte, a family-run company, and but they seem to be going from strength to strength. But again, during 2008, 2009, 2010, if it wasn't for those export opportunities, some of which he alluded to there on the video, this company may not exist today. And as I said, about 40% of his business is international, 60% domestically for the most part. Kind of the counterpart or the opposite side of the coin in terms of counter-cyclical sales is this idea of market seasonality, okay? And what we mean basically is that certain products have seasons. If you're selling John Deere tractors in the U.S., the season is basically in the spring for the most part. That's when most of your demand is going to come. Maybe if in the fall, if you're selling combines or something like that. So you need some backside. So again, some examples of that. John Deere's is able to offset that kind of seasonality in the U.S. market, the North American market, by sales to places like Argentina. Snowmobiles, okay? If you think about it, selling Polaris or Arctic Cat snowmobiles to Chile, their wintertime market is going to be our summer market, and there's not much demand in the U.S. for snowmobiles in the summertime for the most part. Again, fertilizer sales to Brazil would be another example. And so, again, offsetting that kind of counter cyclical side of the equation internationally, as well as kind of leveling off the production process by offsetting some of that seasonality in terms of various types of products. Again, very good reasons why you might want to consider exporting in that regard. So, all right, let's move on. And some of this may sound obvious for the most part, but obviously exporting markets exporting allows you to serve markets where you have either little or no production, or maybe in some cases it may be you may have sole source production at a given facility. And I think most of us know that BMW, our friends in Germany, have a manufacturing facility outside of Charleston, South Carolina. I think that was established, gosh, I guess it's been more than 10 years ago now, something like that. What we probably don't realize is that that particular facility in South Carolina is the sole source production for their X Series SUVs. So what you find is that anywhere in the world where there's a customer for that particular model of SUV, it comes from only one place, and that's the South Carolina facility. And so what they're doing essentially is exporting the X Series from South Carolina through the port of Charleston to customers around the world. So again, and that sole source situation is again another reason why BMW has developed the Charleston plant as kind of an export platform for them for that particular model SUV. Another reason, again, sometimes we don't kind of stop to think about these things, and sometimes I think it's kind of overlooked for the most part, is that exporting can help improve your overall price competitiveness for the most part. We're all familiar with this concept of economies of scale and fixed cost and spreading those fixed costs of manufacturing over a larger volume or a larger number of units outputted for the most part. But I would just suggest to you to give it some thought and look at the concept of how if you increased your volume output by 20% just because as a result of exporting now, what would that do in terms of your overall cost competitiveness? And that's going to have a knock-on effect not only internationally but certainly domestically as well. Again, so that economies of scale would allow us to hopefully improve our cost structure and going forward for the most part and overall competitiveness. And then finally, probably the most important reason to export, especially as we speak today at this point in time, is that it's just a lot easier now than it used to be. Okay, and note that I didn't say it's easy. I just said it's easier now than it's probably ever been in terms of exporting. And we'll touch on a few things as well. Let's look at the first at the right there in terms of transportation and communications. In January, before COVID hit and everything shut down, I took a trip to Singapore, and I flew nonstop on a United flight on a 787 Dreamliner. It's nonstop from Chicago to Singapore. It was a 17-hour flight. Now, having traveled to Asia a number of times over the years, and if it was 5 or 6 years ago before the advent of the 787, I would have flown probably first to San Francisco and then probably had a transit stop in Tokyo or Korea or something like that for the most part. But now, 17 hours later, I was on the ground in Singapore. Telecommunications is probably the most dynamic example of how things have evolved from an international business perspective. When I first started doing business internationally in Singapore in the mid-1980s, we used to communicate with our offices and sometimes with customers through a dedicated telex terminal. I don't know, most of you here probably haven't seen a dedicated telex terminal. It's kind of a museum piece at this point in time for the most part. But again, we've come a long way. We went to then kind of lease line options using FTP protocols. And then, of course, at the end of the decade of the 1980s, we had the fax machine introduced initially in Japan. So I think we can all acknowledge with the advent of the internet and smartphones, we've come a very, very long way from the standpoint of communicating with customers around the world. Again, it's a quantum improvement for the most part. WTO on the left-hand side is today, as of this year, is 25 years old, and so I think sometimes, the WTO gets kind of a bad rap for the most part, but it's certainly, the advent of the WTO and as well as individual free trade agreements that the U.S. has in place has certainly leveled the playing field for exporters. And though, as I said, and though the WTO is not perfect, it's a huge improvement over what it was. In fact, if you look at the average tariff rate on merchandise exports going into quote unquote developed countries, North America and Europe, particularly, we're talking about the average tariff on those any of those imported merchandise products is less than 4%, less than 4%, and that's again a huge change, huge change. And then if you look at a developing country like India, I remember when I first started working in India in 1997. I was working for a Precor company that made fitness equipment, treadmills and ellipticals and all that kind of thing. And we faced a tariff going into India of 50%. Well, India joined the WTO in 1995, and one of the commitments that they made in terms of signing that treaty was that they had to gradually lower their tariffs over I think it was a kind of a 10-year window. They've done that now, and so if you're going to import a Precor treadmill into India now, the tariffs are basically at 10% versus again 50% in 1997. So again, a huge improvement. And India we used to talk about Fortress India. Basically, they really weren't open for business in terms of imported products, but that certainly has changed dramatically. Since they joined the WTO in 1995. And then finally, the advent of regional markets, common markets like the European Union, have facilitated, created, common IP and product standards for the most part. If you think about it, just a few decades ago, you were going to do business in Europe before the advent of the European Union. You would have had to gotten product approval from what would be now 27 separate individual countries. Conversely, fast forward to today with the advent of the European Union and the CE mark, which is a common standard basically for all European Union and European Economic Area products, basically it's one-stop shopping. And so instead of getting individual approval country by country in Europe, again, once you've got that CE mark approval, you're pretty much good for about 30 countries there in Europe. So again, just a considerable savings of time and effort in that regard. Any questions before we kind of move on to the tail end of this? Ian, Dwight, any questions? Okay, if not, I'm going to kind of move on. We've talked about the opportunities and some of the reasons, the practical reasons why Kentucky companies should consider exporting. One of the challenges, and because I started my presentation talking about both the opportunities and the challenges, is certainly the strong dollar. And again, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but I think if we look at some of the trends in terms of the strong dollar, I think one of the key takeaways for Kentucky exporters or any American exporter is that basically you've got to sell value added. If you're in the commodity business, if you're selling strictly on the basis of price, exporting may not be for you for the most part. So let's take a look at this. This is an interesting slide. It compares the US dollar versus a weighted index, or when sometimes they use the word a trade weighted basket of other currencies. So it includes things like the euro, the Canadian dollar, the yen, the Swiss franc, the pesos in there as well, and this pound sterling. And so as you can see, basically around 2002 timeframe, we had a peak in the strength of the US dollar. And then as we move forward into the Great Recession in 2008, 2010, we had a considerable weakening in the dollar. So again, U.S. exporters were very competitive at that point in time. And then as we fast forward to today, we can see that again, U.S. and exporters are kind of faced with this very strong dollar for the most part. In fact, with the advent of COVID in March, we saw some significant strengthening of the U.S. dollar as people didn't know what to do, and so there's what we call this kind of flight to our safe haven currency, which we're talking about in terms of the U.S. So let's wrap up and look at again our NAFTA partners here. This is the Mexican peso. Recall again, I said that basically Mexico joined NAFTA in 1995. We can see in 1995 the exchange rate of the peso to the dollar was about 3-to-1, about 3-to-1. Again, in March of this year, because of COVID, it had fallen as low as 25 pesos to the dollar. It's rallied a little bit now. I think it's somewhere around 22 and a half as of a couple of days ago. But what you see if you annualize this from over the course of from 1995 to 220, the peso has depreciated on an annual compounded basis of about 6% per year. So again, it's not any surprise that a lot of U.S. companies are increasingly looking to Mexico as a source of manufacturing capabilities and things like that because of cost structures there and stuff like that, partly driven by the currency to some extent. And then Canadian dollar, same kind of thing. You can see during this time frame, 2003, again, a weakening of the Canadian dollar, about 162 Canadian to the US dollar during this time frame. And then we saw some gradual strengthening of the Canadian dollar, therefore weakening of the US dollar. But again, during March of this year with the outbreak of COVID, the Canadian dollar was about 1.45 to the US, and again it's rallied a little bit. I think as of a couple of days ago it was about a 135 Canadian to the US. But again, companies, Kentucky companies or US companies in general are going to have to deal with the fact that a strong dollar probably means that they're not going to be able to compete on price. They're going to again have to compete on value added. So just to wrap up, and again, I'll open it up for any questions that you might have. Exporting today, as I said, is not easy, but it's certainly easier today than it ever has been. And a lot of reasons, if you haven't gotten into the export game, that you probably should take a look at it. Again, AKA can work with you in that regard, to White and some of his counterparts. Be happy to make that introduction, as it were. But exporting, as I said, requires a commitment. It may not be for everyone. It's a commitment both of time and money and people and personnel. And so again, it's certainly worth considering, but I'd be the first to acknowledge that it may not be for everyone. And then finally, as I said, particularly because of the strength of the US dollar of late, Kentucky and US exporters need to sell the value added. Again, if you're in the commodities business, probably going to be a pretty tough road to hoe for the most part. With that, I will, we've got a few more minutes here. We'll open it up to any questions that you might have, both in terms of the presentation or in terms of, again, some of the services that AKA can offer in terms of helping you develop kind of an international business strategy. Anybody? Come on, Ian, you got to ask one question. Nobody? Okay, super. Well, my voice is about to fade out anyway, as you probably heard. So I will leave it at that. But thank you for.
You got a question in chat.
Oh, do you? Okay, good.
It's what effect do you think the CARES, government debt, and other monies pumped into the market will have on the strength of the U.S. dollar?
Again, the dollar. Again, this kind of. Again, the dollar's been known historically as kind of a safe haven currency. And so, again, there's this idea of this flight to quality. So what you found was that when COVID really hit the world in March, and we really kind of came to grips with what it all meant, almost without exception, most currencies, with the exception of the dollar and a few other ones like the Japanese yen and a few other ones, basically they depreciated against the US dollar. And again, peso and Canadian dollar are good examples of that, as I talked about. The last couple of months, what you've seen is kind of a gradual return to normalcy or a gradual weakening in the U.S. dollar, and that is in the era of CARES financing and spending and things like that. So I think going forward that we're going to probably still see a continued gradual weakening of the dollar. Again, my business is not foreign exchange forecasting. That's not my area of expertise, but kind of intuitively, we've seen ups and downs over the last 20-year time frame in terms of the dollar. My sense is that all this spending and things like that is probably going to hasten the depreciation of the dollar, but it's not going to be a rapid fall off. But I think it will have some impact in terms of a gradual. I would call it kind of not so much a depreciation of the dollar, but kind of a return to normalcy, if you will, because as you saw, we've been dealing with a pretty high price dollar for the last 4 or 5 years or so. Any other questions Go ahead.
Yeah, I got one for you. So,
Okay.
what would you say to the manufacturer who has had maybe recently, maybe in the last year, an inquiry from a potential foreign customer? What would you say to them? So they've had someone from Germany, for example, ask about getting their product in their country. What would you say to that company?
Well, I would say tremendously important to, whether you're a six-man band company, a small company of, five or six people, or whether you're a big company. I mean, it's inevitable again in the age of the internet that you're going to get queries on a pretty regular basis. Some of them are probably very legitimate queries, and some of them, they're just, some of them probably not so legitimate. They're just kind of, wasting time. But I think the key point is that you should have a designated person within your organization that all those queries come through. I'll just share with you an example of my own experience years ago. I was in Monterey, California. I was working for a small manufacturer of flow meters, basically thermal mass flow meters, and there was a query that came in from a potential distributor in Indonesia. And at that point in time, Fox Thermal didn't have any kind of distribution or representation in Indonesia. And so I got this query and I looked up the company online. And what really impressed me was this company was a combustion specialist. They specialize in technologies to improve the combustion process and the efficiencies and things like that, which was very impressive in its own right. And they would use our flow meters to meter methane or natural gas supplies into their burners and things like that. But what really impressed me about this company was the number of other U.S. companies that were its principals, if you will. And so I can remember I was really excited because finding a good distributor or representative in Indonesia can be a challenge. Over the years I've kind of worked with companies in that regard, and Indonesia can be a bit of a maze for the most part. And so when I saw this company that they were kind of reaching out to us. I mean, I jumped on that immediately. I responded back, said, can we set up a time to call? As it turned out, I had a racquetball match that night, but literally on the way home, again, this is with the advent of cell phones, I spent an hour on the phone with the owner of the company. And it was interesting. It wasn't so much selling my product to him. It was really, I had to sell the organization to him because he treasured his reputation. Again, reputations in Indonesia are kind of hard to come by, good reputations in particular for a lot of companies. And so he really valued this. And so he wasn't going to, unless he was convinced that Fox Thermal was a good company to work with, he wasn't really interested in taking it on. And so as it turned out, after an hour of conversation on the phone, he said, as it turned out, I was going to be in Singapore a couple of weeks later on a business trip on my way to India. I said, why don't I come down to Jakarta to meet with you and do some training with your people? And he said, sure, why don't you do that? And so I think the moral of the story is, Ian, you need to respond immediately. And at the same time, in this case, it just worked out that I was going to be in that area for a business trip anyway. And I think he was very impressed that I was kind of dropping everything. And a couple of weeks later, I was sitting in his office for the most part. So I think that long answer to your question, but I think, I've seen so many cases where queries come in and they just sit in somebody's inbox for weeks and weeks and weeks. And a lot of those, again, may not be legitimate, but they're certainly, if someone's had the time and taken the time and effort to look up your company and check out your website, I think they deserve a reply. And it sounds pretty basic, but you'd be surprised how many American companies just can't be bothered for the most part. So I think, as a start, that would be a good place to start the process with the German company you mentioned. And again, maybe there's a trade show coming up in, Hannover Messe is a pretty famous trade show that's held in Germany every year for the most part. Maybe this particular individual is going to be visiting there. Maybe you had plans to exhibit there or something like that. So again, it would be a good opportunity to kind of move that process forward. I don't think you want to rush into anything. I remember years ago when I was set with Precor, the fitness company, and I was in Sri Lanka, and I had a couple companies that were interested in representing the product there in Sri Lanka. And again, meeting 2 or 3 companies, of course, everybody wanted it, and everybody wanted to kind of, impress me with what they could do and how they could do it and how successful they could be with Precor products in that country. But I think it's important to kind of take it one step at a time, and it's also important to use programs like Gold Key that the Department of Commerce has and things like that to actually go out on the ground and meet with these things. When I was in India on a Gold Key assignment for Precor, I could have easily had these people come to my hotel and it would have been a lot easier. But I was adamant that I wanted to go out and visit their facilities and knock on their door and get to know them and their staff, because some of these companies, I think I had 16 companies set up in the course of a week's time in India, and I think a lot of those companies were just kind of one-man bands for the most part. And so I would have never known that if I hadn't gone out and kind of literally sat in their front office and met with them. So that's a longer answer to your question, but that would be a kind of a logical next step. It's beyond the initial communication process. Any other questions before we call it a day? Okay, if not, we'll kind of shut it down here. Kim, did you have any final words about maybe the next or upcoming webinars that we have planned?
No, I just want to thank everyone for their time and for joining us today. And thank you, Marvin, for your presentation.
Very good. Thanks again. And again, those of you that hopefully we quirk a couple people's interests, and if so, again, contact the business development people or myself at AKA. And again, a logical first step would be this Export Tech program. And I'll again, if there's an interest, I can go into more detail on that later on. But that would be a good place to start in terms of kind of educating yourself on some of the nuances of doing business overseas. Thanks again, folks. I will sign off from here.